Greetings. The last time we were following Christ as he surveyed the land, and we figured out through the narratives that many of Christ's future disciples or apostles are being baptized by the Baptist. So now we're in July in 29 AD, which is Tammuz. Once I saw 4 men, among them some of his future disciples, on the high road between Samaria and Nazareth. They were in a shady place waiting for Jesus, who, with one companion, was coming that way. When he arrived in sight, they set forward to meet him. They told him that they had been baptized by John, and that he had spoken of the near coming of the Messiah. They told him also John's severe language toward the soldiers, only a few of whom he had baptized. Among other things, he had said that it would be better to take the stones out of the Jordan and baptize them rather than such as they. I saw these disciples of John walking on with Jesus. Tuesday. This is Saturday to Tuesday. Jesus then went along the Sea of Galilee toward the north. He spoke very plainly of the Messiah. In many places the possessed cried after him. Out of one man he drove a devil, and he taught in the schools. 6 men who were coming from the baptism of John met Jesus. Among them were Levi, known later as Matthew, and 2 sons of the widowed relatives of Elizabeth. They all knew Jesus, some through relationship, others by hearsay, and they strongly suspected, though they had had no assurance of it, that he was the one of whom John had spoken. They spoke of John, of Lazarus, and his sisters, especially of Magdalene. They supposed she had a devil, for she was already living apart from her family in the castle of Magdala. These men accompanied Jesus and were filled with astonishment at his discourse. The aspirants to baptism, going from Galilee to John, used to tell him all that they knew and heard of Jesus, while they that came from Aenon, where John baptized, used to tell Jesus all they knew of John. Wednesday. Jesus went alone to the sea, passing through a fence into an enclosed fishery where lay 5 ships. On the shore were several huts for the accommodation of the fishermen. Peter, the owner of this fishery, was in one of the huts with Andrew. John and James with their father Zebedee and several others were on the boats. In the middle one was Peter's father-in-law with his 3 sons. I once knew all their names, but now I've forgotten them. The father was surnamed the Zealot, because he had gained his point in a dispute with the Romans concerning the right of navigation on the lake. There were about 30 men on the boat. Jesus went along the shore by the fenced-off way between the huts and the boats, speaking with Andrew and the others. I know not whether he spoke to Peter. They did not know him as yet. He spoke of John and of the near coming of the Messiah. Andrew was already a baptized disciple of John. Jesus told them that he would come to them again. Thursday. Jesus turned off from the lake and went further on toward Lebanon. This he was led to do chiefly by the numerous reports current throughout the country and the great excitement to which they gave rise. Many looked upon John as the Messiah, but others spoke of another whom John's words seemed to designate. The companions of Jesus on this journey numbered from 6 to 12. Some turned off at different points on the road, while others joined him. His instructions pleased them, and they began to think that he must be the one of whom John spoke. Jesus attached himself particularly to none. He was properly speaking alone, but he was sowing and preparing. In all that he did, I saw many relations to the actions of the prophets and to their fulfillment, especially to those of Elijah. Friday. Jesus went with his companions over a spur of the Lebanon mountains toward the great city Sidon, lying along the sea. From the mountain height, the view was indescribably beautiful. The city was apparently quite close to the sea, but viewed from its own plain, one could see that it was fully 45 minutes distant from the shore. It was a large, busy place. Gazing down upon it from on high, one might fancy that he was looking upon an innumerable fleet of ships. For from the numerous flat roofs arose a forest of high poles and flagstaffs, with long streamers of red and other colors, while white canvas was stretched from pole to pole or floated in the breeze. These booths were swarming with people at their different avocations. Between the houses I saw all kinds of shining vessels being prepared. The country around was dotted with exceedingly fertile spots, all teeming with fruit. In and around these gardens were numbers of immense trees, some surrounded by seats. Steps led up into others, so that quite a company could sit in their branches as in a summer house. The plain in which the city lay between the mountain and the sea was not very broad. There were both Jews and pagans in the city. They carried on business with one another, and idolatry was general. The Lord on his way taught and preached in the shady places under the great trees, speaking of John, of his baptism, and of penance. Jesus was well received in the city. He had been there once before. In the school he taught of the coming of the Messiah and of the downfall of idolatry. Queen Jezebel, who so persecuted Elijah, was from this city. Jesus left his companions in Sidon and went to a little place more to the south and away from the sea. He wanted to be alone to pray. On one side it was entirely flanked by wood. It had thick walls and was surrounded by vineyards. It was Sarepta, the place in which Elijah was fed by the widow. The Jews, as also the pagans, had a superstition connected with that fact. They always allowed pious widows to live in the city walls. They thought by doing so they secured themselves from every danger and could practice every sort of vice in the city. Old men dwelt in the walls at the same time of which I am now speaking. Now this next section is Saturday, July 9th to Tuesday, July 19th. Jesus lodged with an old man in the city wall in the house once occupied by that widow who fed Elijah. The old men who then dwelt in the walls were something like hermits. They lived there in accordance with an ancient custom honoring Elijah, meditating and explaining the prophecies, and chiefly engaged in prayer for the coming of the Messiah. Jesus taught them concerning the Messiah and the baptism of John. They were pious, but entertained many erroneous ideas, of which one was that the Messiah was to come in worldly splendor. Jesus often retired to the wood near Sarepta and there prayed alone. He taught in the synagogue and occupied himself also in instructing the children. In the villages around, in which there were numbers of pagans, he exhorted the people not to mix with them. There were some good people here and some very bad ones. Jesus had no companions, excepting occasionally some resident of the place. I saw him teaching men and women in the open air, often in haylocks and under trees. The climate here is such that it always seemed to me we are in May, because in Palestine the grain for the second harvest is as far advanced as it is with us in that month. They do not cut the grain so close to the ground as we do. They grasp the stalk below the ear and cut it off a little under 4 feet long. They do not thrash it. They stand the little sheaves upright and pass over them a roller fastened between two oxen. The grain is much drier than ours and falls out readily. They separate it in the open air, or in a kind of circular barn with a thatched roof but open on all sides. Wednesday. From Sarepta, Jesus went to a place lying to the northeast, not far from the plain upon which Ezekiel, caught up in spirit, had the vision of the dry bones coming together. Sinews and flesh took possession of them. The winds passed over them, spirit and life entered into them. I was told that the coming together of the bones and their clothing with flesh were fulfilled by the teaching and baptism of John. But the spirit and life breathed into them was accomplished by Jesus through redemption and by the descent of the Holy Spirit. Jesus consoled the people who were very poor and oppressed, and explained to them the vision of Ezekiel. Thursday. When he left this place, he went northward to the country which John had first visited on leaving the desert. It was little sheep rearing place. Naomi and her daughter Ruth dwelt there a long time. Naomi had so good a name among the people that she is still spoken of in these parts. Later, she removed to Bethlehem. The Lord taught very zealously here. The time approached for him to retrace his steps southward and thence to Samaria for his baptism. Jacob also owned fields up here. Through this place ran a little river, back of which far up in the desert lay John's spring. From this spring the road became very steep, reminding me of that which Adam and Eve took when driven from paradise. It led down to the battlefield of Ezekiel. On Adam and Eve's route, the trees became smaller and smaller and quite misshapen until at last they reached a desolate region where they grew some miserable bushes. Paradise was as high above the earth as is the sun. After the fall, it disappeared behind a mountain which seemed to rise before it. The Savior, on his return from the shepherd's country to Sarepta, followed the route trodden by the prophet Elijah when going from Brook Cherith to Sarepta. Jesus taught here and there as he journeyed on, passing by Sidon. Friday and Saturday were in later July. From Sarepta, he was soon to go southward for his baptism. He kept the Sabbath at Sarepta. After the Sabbath, Jesus started for Nazareth, teaching at various points on the road. He was sometimes attended by companions and sometimes alone. He went barefoot, putting his sandals on only when about to enter any town or village. Sunday and Monday, July 24th and 25th. He passed through the valleys toward Mount Carmel, and once he was near the road leading down into Egypt, but he turned off to the east. The mother of God, Mary Cleophas, the mother of Parmenas, and two other women I saw going to Nazareth, while Zarephath, afterward Veronica, Joanna Chusa, and the son of Veronica, who later on joined the disciples, were on their way to the same place from Jerusalem. They were going to visit Mary, with whom they had become acquainted on their yearly journeys to the holy city. Mary and Joseph, as also other pious families, were in the habit of visiting through devotion 3 places during the year, viz. The Temple of Jerusalem, the pine tree near Bethlehem, and Mount Carmel. Anne's family and other pious people usually went to the last named place in May when returning from Jerusalem. There were on the mountain a well and a cave of Elijah, the latter like a chapel. Devout Jews were constantly visiting these hallowed places. They came, not at fixed times, but whenever it best suited them, and prayed for the coming of the Messiah. Jewish hermits dwelt on the mountain, and later on Christian Cenobites had their cells. In a little town on the west side of Mount Tabor, Jesus taught in the school and spoke of John's baptism. There were 5 followers around him, among them some future disciples. Wednesday, the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem dispatched couriers with letters to all the principal places of Palestine in which were Jewish schools and rabbis, telling them to be on their guard against a certain man of whom the Baptist said that he was the one who was to come and that he would soon present himself for baptism. They should have an eye upon the man and give information of his actions, for if he were indeed the Messiah, he needed not the baptism of John. The members of the Sanhedrin also were very much annoyed when they learned that Jesus was he who as a boy had taught in the temple. The couriers went likewise to a city on the road near Hebron, 4 hours from the sea. In that country wherein the spies of Aaron and Moses found the huge bunches of grapes. The city is called Gaza. There was a very long row of tents reaching from the city to the sea. Under them, different kinds of woolen and silk stuffs exposed for sale. Friday and Saturday, late July. Jesus with 5 followers taught here and there down the country around Jacob's well, where he celebrated the Sabbath. And I'm going to end the reading there. All right, so some notes. One, the italicized stuff really didn't say anything the text said this time, except it gave references. So the episode of the widow, Elijah and the widow, was from 1 Kings 17, verse 9. Ezekiel's vision of the bones, which represents a resurrecting movement, which I'll get into later, that's Ezekiel 37. The book of Ruth is referenced with Naomi and her daughter-in-law, who was a widow, the namesake of the book, Ruth. So Ruth is, I think, the book right after Judges. So some things to note. First of all, she's saying here that Levi wasn't, she's not saying it directly, but we have this idea that Matthew was like evil and then all of a sudden he turned good kind of thing. And we see it in the movies, right? And we see it in The Chosen. They sort of made Matthew like an autistic character for some reason. I don't know. They do this as a method of pathos, which entertainment-wise, it works, but it wasn't fact. So anyways, first of all, she's saying here that Levi wasn't magically transformed into apostle. Levi, i.e. Matthew, was baptized by John the Baptist, so he had the faith already. He was still a tax collector for the Romans. Really, we call tax collectors accountants these days. It's a friendlier way of saying it, but they are tax collectors. That's what they do. They divvy the taxes. They want to pay. They pay you your paycheck, but they take off the taxes. And they're good accountants if they calculate it correctly. So they do the deed, and it's at the blame of the rulers, not at the accountants. It wasn't Matthew's fault that the Romans are collecting taxes. And Matthew was like an accountant. So keep in mind, he is a half-brother to 3 of the apostles. The 3 sons of Mary Cleophas. She was married to Alphaeus, but Alphaeus was priorly married to another, and he begot Matthew through them. So Matthew was the half-brother of Simon the Zealot and Judas Thaddeus, and I don't remember the third. The good old short life expectancies confusing everyone. All right, so Jesus actually did drive out a devil here, but I think he kept it low profile. B, he went north of Galilee, and John only went there briefly. And this is towards the mountain of Lebanon. Next, Jesus was visiting places which feels like callbacks, like he's gone to collect the essence of each location, like a pilgrim. We profit from pilgrimages as Catholics. If we go to, say, Fatima, Lourdes, sites in Italy of the saints and whatnot, and Jesus going to holy places almost as though to acknowledge them. Now, there was this anecdote about Saint Philomena. They were transporting her bones, and there were a lot of things going on there, but one of them is that they were passing by a field and the horses wouldn't move. No matter what they did, they couldn't get the horses to move. And it was like she was acknowledging that field as a place for martyrs. So something very holy happened there. Well, Jesus acknowledges this. He goes to the holy places of the saints, almost like he's coming to reap what is sown by the great people of the past, right? Next, Jesus warns people, don't mix with the pagans. Have to underline that. This is in the Genesis, where the parents are telling them, don't mix with the Canaanites. Don't mix. So choose your friends wisely, or you will become tepid. It's not something you can control. It's just we are built up of our experiences in general. We activate our will against these things, but doing so means to pick proper friendships. So Jesus isolated himself to pray here and in the gospel, perhaps for that very reason. The realms we're in will influence us and begin to gravitate us. And perhaps Jesus went alone in order to pray, in order to destroy that gravity, to reattach himself to God the Father, that is. He is God the Son. And to tell us that we have to isolate ourselves from worldly culture in order for us to kill that gravity in ourselves. We have to spend time away from the worldly and ensure that God gravitates us more than the world does. So the last note, this is a pretty big one. The books of the prophets are very interesting to read and something we all profit from. But we all stand to profit from them even more in our time than we would, say, if we were living in 1600. Because we're living in times very similar to what these prophets went through. Isaiah is kind of strange because it seems like it's composed in two separate eras. Like Isaiah wrote the first part, perhaps his disciples wrote the second, in continuing with his message. But he dealt with the Assyrians. That is, he dealt with the rise of the Assyrians who were tormenting the Jews. Jeremiah dealt with the Babylonians who tormented the Jews, as did Ezekiel. Now, I call late age literature, that is the books of the prophets, late age literature. Think of the 7 churches in Revelation 2 and 3. 2 was the rising and 3 was the downfall. In Revelation 3, we're dealing with the downfall of Catholicism. In Sardis, it's the apostasy, the loss of the spirit, while the flesh reigns. In Philadelphia, it's the weakness. And in Laodicea, it's the restoration, but then the laxity that takes over during it. When you read Judges, you see Israel falling in and out of love with God. And the ends of their cycles is always idolatry and faithlessness, mixing with the pagans. Just like what the prophets deal with, just like what we're going through with the apostasy of Sardis, the 5th church, and the lamentations of Philadelphia, the 6th church. It's like the bones are falling apart. And in Philadelphia, they're apart. They're on the ground. Now, a lot of Catholics believe we're in the 5th age, as if these set of bones still has flesh on them. But I do believe we're in the 6th. The bones are scattered. I don't just believe we're in the 6th. I'm practically certain of it, but I won't get into that now. And I have a lot to say on the matter because I studied eschatology quite a bit. Anyways, The apostasy happened early last century. And now Catholicism has become culturally weak and irrelevant. To practice Catholicism today is persecution. After the last monarchy fell, I think the Austrian one, it basically led into the Sixth Age. We must understand this. We're now all passengers and none of us are drivers. We're politically irrelevant. Abortion is proof of our political and social and cultural irrelevance. It's in every country now. We think of the last few papacies, and I think especially of that of John Paul II. He didn't at all act like a priest king, but more like a current British monarch, giving speeches, giving that hand wave to the crowd, riding his papamobile, and being a mascot rather than a leader. This is what characterizes our times. We've lost our royalty, the regalia of being God's favored, and it's largely because we're mixing with the pagans. The Novus Ordo Mass is supposed to be the man, well, the Mass rather, is supposed to be the man that eats of the lion, eats the Christ, becomes the lion. Instead, it's the lion that eats of the man and becomes humanistic, which is the whole argument of ad orientem versus ad populum. Ad populum, we're eating of the people, not eating of Christ. We're supposed to face the east, the rising of the sun, but we're facing the setting of the sun. Because this Novus Ordo characterizes the times that we're living in. It's the sea washing that is turning us Catholics into nominals. We're losing the faith that the real presence is in the Eucharist. This is what destroyed our production of saints. Given our population, we should have saints all over the place. We don't. That's turned us into the withered fig tree that Christ crossed by when he was headed to Jerusalem. That's giving very few figs and giving leaves instead. I mean, I just look at the future canonization of Blessed Carlos Acutis. Now, I don't blame them for it, but compare his life and that of Theresa Neumann, who happened during World War II, who's barely even recognized in our time, and they're sainting Carlos. Why? It's not that you disagree, but he should be down the queue. We have to detect that something is seriously wrong, and that blessed kid is probably in heaven. But why is the church underlining these non-mystical saints and scoffing at all of the mystical ones? Scoffing at Pope Leo XIII for pointing out that Freemasons are a massive threat. We are in these times waiting for the second coming, with the kings that decide to listen to the false prophets rather than the true prophets. The false prophets who assure them that God is with them, that everything is randy-dandy. Not listening to the true prophets who are saying things are falling apart. We're bones. We're bones. We're a shadow of what we once were. This is why when we read passages like Ezekiel 37, yes, it was fulfilled then with the coming of the Messiah, but it will also be fulfilled with us. These are types. When we read the book of the Apocalypse, it uses these types, these very types. It references them even. They occur again and again. And this is why they profit us to read them, to study them, to make them part of ourselves. We are like Christ going through the holy places, but we don't have to leave our homes. They're in the Bible. They're on the internet. We can visit these places in spirit and in truth. This church will come together like a bunch of bones, coming together like the flesh, the muscles, the sinews, being formed, and alas, like the spirit and life is restored to it. Remember, she said, in the end, my immaculate heart will triumph. We read this and like Ezekiel 37, and we have to think, yeah, we're in the same boat. That's it. Ave Maria.